The judge looked at the young black man in the expensive suit and assumed he was just another defendant trying to look respectable. At 28, Marcus Williams had grown accustomed to the stares, the whispered assumptions, the way people sized him up based on his age and race rather than his credentials. The court clerk had already prepared the public defender paperwork, assuming he couldn't afford real representation. The prosecutor across the room smirked, thinking this would be an easy win against some inexperienced legal aid attorney. Even the bailiff positioned himself closer, expecting potential trouble from what he assumed was just another young black man in the system. But when Marcus opened his mouth to speak and revealed his true identity, the entire courtroom would realize they had made the most embarrassing mistake of their careers. It was 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, and the Cook County Courthouse buzzed with its usual mixture of anxiety and resignation. Defendants sat nervously in the gallery, attorneys shuffled papers with practiced indifference, and court officers maintained their watchful position. Judge Patricia Holbrook had seen it all in her 23 years on the bench. Drug dealers, gang members, white-collar criminals, domestic violence cases, they all blended together after a while, becoming just another case number in an endless stream of human failure and legal procedure. Marcus Williams entered the courtroom at exactly 9:18 a.m., his charcoal gray Tom Ford suit impeccable despite the early hour, his leather briefcase, a graduation gift from his mother when he passed the bar exam, contained documents that would change multiple lives before lunch. But none of that mattered to the people watching him walk down the aisle between the wooden benches. All they saw was what they expected to see: another young black man in trouble with the law, probably trying to look respectable for sentencing. The whispers started immediately. Court clerk Sandra Morrison leaned toward her assistant. "Looks like another one trying to clean up his act for the judge," she murmured, pulling out the standard public defender assignment forms. "Probably spent his last dollar on that suit." Her assistant nodded knowingly. They had seen it countless times before. Defendants who showed up in expensive clothes they couldn't afford, thinking appearance would somehow mitigate their crimes. Judge Holbrook glanced up from her paperwork and made her own assumption. The young man looked too young to be an experienced attorney, too composed to be a nervous defendant, but his presence in her courtroom during a criminal docket suggested only one thing. She had developed what she considered a keen eye for reading people, and everything about this situation screamed defendant with delusions of grandeur. Assistant District Attorney Robert Chen sat at the prosecution table, organizing his files for the morning's cases. When he noticed Marcus, he barely suppressed a laugh. Chen had been prosecuting criminal cases for 8 years, and he recognized the type immediately. Young, arrogant, probably representing himself or working with some cut-rate attorney who couldn't be bothered to show up on time. This was going to be easier than he thought. The bailiff, Officer James Murphy, subtly adjusted his position to get a better view of the young man. In his experience, well-dressed defendants were often the most dangerous. They had money, which meant drugs, or gangs, which meant potential violence. His hand remained casually near his service weapon, a precaution that had become second nature after 15 years of courthouse security. Marcus took a seat in the front row, directly behind the defense table. He set his briefcase down with deliberate calm and checked his watch. The irony wasn't lost on him. In less than 10 minutes, everyone in this room would discover that their assumptions weren't just wrong, they were catastrophically wrong. Judge Holbrook called the court to order. Case number 2024 CR 8847, People of Illinois versus Detective Raymond Morrison. She looked up expectantly, waiting for the attorneys to announce their appearances. Adia Chen stood immediately. Robert Chen for the people, Your Honor. There was a pause. Judge Holbrook scanned the courtroom, her eyes settling on Marcus. And for the defendant, Marcus rose slowly, his movement fluid and confident. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. Marcus Williams, United States Attorney's Office, Northern District of Illinois, appearing for the federal government, Your Honor. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Holbrook's pen froze halfway to her notepad. Ada Chen's mouth opened slightly, his carefully arranged files suddenly forgotten. The court clerk's hand stopped moving over the public defender form. Even Officer Murphy straightened unconsciously, his casual surveillance stance shifting to one of professional attention. Marcus continued without missing a beat. Your Honor, I'm here to inform the court that Detective Morrison is subject to federal charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under color of law. The federal government formally requests that this defendant be remanded to federal custody pending arraignment in federal court. Judge Holbrook found her voice first, though it cracked slightly. Mr. Williams, can you provide proper identification to verify your position? Marcus opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency and handed his federal credentials to the bailiff, who examined them carefully before passing them to the judge. The gold badge and official identification card left no room for doubt. United States Attorney's Office, Northern District of Illinois. Federal Prosecutor. GS-15 level. Security clearance. Top secret. The whispers in the gallery grew louder. Defense attorneys who had been half asleep suddenly paid attention. Court reporters who had been mechanically transcribing routine proceedings looked up with interest. Word began to spread through the courthouse like wildfire. A federal prosecutor had just walked into Judge Holbrook's courtroom to arrest one of their own. But Marcus wasn't finished. Your Honor, Detective Morrison is one of 17 law enforcement officials named in a federal indictment unsealed this morning. The charges stem from a 3-year investigation into systemic corruption, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations within the Chicago Police Department's South District. ADHN finally found his voice. Your Honor, I object to these proceedings. This court has jurisdiction over. Marcus turned toward him with the kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty. Mr. Chen, federal charges take precedence over state charges when they involve violations of federal civil rights statutes. I'm sure you learned that in law school. The comment was delivered without malice, but its effect was immediate. Chen's face flushed red, and several attorneys in the gallery couldn't suppress quiet chuckles. Judge Holbrook was scrambling to maintain control of her courtroom. Mr. Williams, while I acknowledge your credentials, I need to understand the scope of these federal charges before I can— Of course, Your Honor. Marcus opened his briefcase again and produced a thick manila folder. This contains copies of the federal indictment, arrest warrants, and supporting documentation. Detective Morrison is charged with conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and racketeering under the RICO Act. The defendant, Detective Raymond Morrison, who had been sitting quietly at the defense table, finally spoke. This is bullshit. I've been a cop for 20 years. Some kid in an expensive suit thinks he can. Detective Morrison, Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you exercise that right. The transformation in the courtroom was complete. What had begun as a routine state criminal proceeding had become a federal corruption case. The assumptions everyone had made about the young black man in the expensive suit had crumbled in less than 5 minutes. But Marcus Williams wasn't done yet. This moment, this exact situation was why he had become a federal prosecutor in the first place. He had grown up in Chicago's South Side, where Detective Morrison and officers like him had terrorized his neighborhood for years. He had watched friends and family members become victims of police brutality, evidence tampering, and systematic discrimination. He had seen young black men like himself treated as criminals before they had committed any crime, judged by their appearance rather than their action. But Marcus had channeled his anger into action. Harvard Law School, summa cum laude. Federal clerkship with the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, 3 years with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division before being recruited by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago. At 28, he was the youngest federal prosecutor in the district's history, specializing in police corruption and civil rights violations, and Detective Morrison was about to become his biggest conviction. Your Honor, Marcus continued, the federal investigation has uncovered evidence that Detective Morrison and his co-conspirators engaged in a pattern of civil rights violations targeting primarily African American suspects. They planted evidence, filed false reports, and used excessive force while knowing their actions were both illegal and unconstitutional. Judge Holbrook was reading through the federal documents, her expression growing more serious with each page. Mr. Williams, these are very serious charges. Yes, Your Honor, they are. The federal government has audio recordings, video evidence, and testimony from multiple witnesses. Detective Morrison and 16 other officers systematically violated the civil rights of citizens under color of law. They betrayed their oaths, violated public trust, and damaged the very communities they were sworn to protect. Detective Morrison's attorney, a public defender named James Riley who had just arrived, looked confused and overwhelmed. Your Honor, I need time to review these federal charges and, Mr. Riley, Marcus interrupted, your client will be arraigned in federal court this afternoon. Federal marshals are waiting outside to transport him to the Metropolitan Correctional Center. The reality was sinking in for everyone in the courtroom. This wasn't just about Detective Morrison. This was about systematic corruption, civil rights violations, and federal accountability. The young black man they had all dismissed as a defendant was actually the prosecutor who had spent 3 years building a case that would send corrupt police officers to federal prison. ADA Chen attempted to salvage his position. Your Honor, the state has significant resources invested in this case, and we believe Marcus turned to face him directly. Mr. Chen, the state had Detective Morrison charged with aggravated assault, a misdemeanor. The federal charges include conspiracy and racketeering, which carry sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. I think we can agree that federal jurisdiction is appropriate. The difference was clear to everyone present. The state was treating Detective Morrison's crimes as simple assault. The federal government was treating them as part of a criminal conspiracy that violated constitutional rights. The message was unmistakable. When local authorities failed to hold police accountable, federal prosecutors would step in. Judge Holbrook made her decision. Mr. Williams, the court recognizes federal jurisdiction in this matter. Detective Morrison will be remanded to federal custody pending his federal arraignment. But Marcus wasn't finished. This moment was about more than just Detective Morrison. It was about every assumption that had been made when he walked into the courtroom. It was about every young black man who had been judged by his appearance rather than his accomplishments. It was about accountability, justice, and the power of proving people wrong. He turned to address the entire courtroom. Detective Morrison's arrest is the first of many. The federal investigation into police corruption in Chicago is ongoing, and additional arrests will follow. Any officer who has violated civil rights under color of law, any official who has participated in or covered up these violations, and any institution that has enabled this corruption will be held accountable. The silence in the courtroom was profound. Court officers who had been preparing for routine proceedings now stood at attention. Defense attorneys who had been reviewing plea bargains suddenly realized they might be representing clients who were victims of the very corruption being prosecuted. Prosecutors who had worked with Detective Morrison began mentally reviewing their cases, wondering what evidence might have been tainted. Marcus packed his briefcase methodically, each movement deliberate and professional. As he prepared to leave, he made eye contact with Judge Holbrook. Your Honor, the federal government appreciates the court's cooperation in this matter. Federal marshals will coordinate with court security regarding Detective Morrison's transport. Judge Holbrook nodded slowly. Mr. Williams, thank you for bringing this matter to the court's attention. The court supports federal accountability in cases involving civil rights violations. As Marcus walked toward the courtroom exit, the whispers followed him. But they were different now. Instead of assumptions about criminality, they were expressions of amazement, respect, and not a little fear. He had walked into the courtroom as a suspected defendant and was leaving as the federal prosecutor who had just dismantled a corruption network. Detective Morrison sat in stunned silence as federal marshals approached his table. The expensive suit he had mocked, the youth he had dismissed, the race he had prejudged, none of it mattered now. What mattered was that Marcus Williams had spent 3 years building an airtight federal case, and Detective Morrison was going to federal prison. But the real victory wasn't Detective Morrison's arrest. The real victory was the transformation that had occurred in that courtroom. Every person present had been forced to confront their assumptions about young black men in expensive suits. They had learned that appearance doesn't determine ability, that age doesn't determine authority, and that race doesn't determine competence. As Marcus reached the courtroom door, he turned back for one final statement. Ladies and gentlemen, federal law enforcement doesn't discriminate based on the badge someone wears or the uniform they put on. Corruption is corruption, regardless of who commits it. Civil rights violations are federal crimes, regardless of who authorizes them. And justice is justice, regardless of who delivers it. The door closed behind him, leaving a courtroom forever changed by the encounter. Judge Holbrook would later describe it as one of the most educational moments of her judicial career. Ada Chen would request additional training on federal jurisdiction and civil rights law. The court clerk would never again assume that well-dressed young black men were defendants rather than attorneys. And Detective Morris, he would plead guilty to federal charges and cooperate with ongoing investigations, helping to expose the full scope of corruption in Chicago's police department. His 20-year career in law enforcement would end with a federal prison sentence and a lifetime ban from working in any capacity that involved public trust. Outside the courthouse, Marcus Williams stood on the steps and called his mother. "Mom, it's done. Morrison is in federal custody, and the other arrests will follow." His mother's voice cracked with emotion. "Your father would be so proud, baby. You're fighting for people who can't fight for themselves." Marcus looked back at the courthouse where he had just shattered every assumption about his identity, his capabilities, and his purpose. He thought about all the young black men who had been victimized by Detective Morrison and officers like him. He thought about the communities that had been terrorized by police corruption and the families who had been torn apart by false arrests and planted evidence. But mostly, he thought about the power of proving people wrong, not through anger or confrontation, but through excellence, preparation, and unwavering commitment to justice. He had walked into that courtroom knowing exactly what people would think about him, and he had used their assumptions against them. The federal investigation would continue. More arrests would follow. More corrupt officers would face federal charges, and Marcus Williams would be there to prosecute every case, proving again and again that justice doesn't care about your assumptions, your prejudices, or your preconceptions. It only cares about the truth, and today, the truth had won. Outside the courthouse, Marcus Williams stood on the steps and called the families who had been waiting years for this moment. The first call was to Maria Santos, whose son had been arrested by Detective Morrison on planted drug charges. "Miss Santos," Marcus said when she answered, "Detective Morrison is in federal custody. The nightmare is over." Her tears were audible through the phone. "My boy missed his senior year of high school because of that man." Marcus listened to her pain, remembering why he had chosen this career path. "Mrs. Santos, we're going to make this right." The second call was to James Washington, who had spent 18 months in prison after Detective Morrison fabricated assault charges. "Mr. Washington, Morrison is going to federal prison. The civil rights lawsuit can move forward now." James's voice was emotional. "Mr. Williams, I never thought I'd see the day when cops got held accountable. Thank you." As Marcus walked back toward the federal building, he reflected on the morning's events. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Martinez was waiting in his office with files spread across every surface. "Marcus, we've got cooperation agreements from 4 officers already. They want to flip on the bigger fish." The scope of the corruption was staggering. Detective Morrison hadn't been working alone. The investigation had uncovered a network of officers who protected each other's criminal activity and retaliated against anyone who tried to report them. They had operated with impunity for years, confident that their badges made them untouchable. But Marcus Williams had touched them, and he wasn't finished. Later that afternoon, Marcus was reviewing witness statements when his assistant announced a visitor. A teenager, maybe 17, stood nervously in his doorway, accompanied by a community advocate. "Mr. Williams," the woman said, "this is Deshaun Miller. He wanted to meet you since he heard about Detective Morrison's arrest." The teenager stepped forward. "Sir, I wanted to say thank you. Detective Morrison arrested me 2 years ago for something I didn't do. Nobody believed me except my grandmother." Marcus remembered the case. Deshaun had been wrongfully detained and charged with resisting arrest. "What you went through was wrong, Deshaun. No young person should experience that abuse of power. I want to be a lawyer like you, Mr. Williams. I want to help people who can't help themselves. Marcus smiled. If you're serious about law school, come see me when you graduate. We have programs that can help prepare you. As the afternoon ended, Marcus reflected on the real impact of his work. Detective Morrison's arrest was just the beginning. The federal investigation would continue, more corrupt officers would be prosecuted, and systemic changes would be implemented. But the most important victory was inspiring young people like Deshawn to believe that justice was possible. As Marcus packed up his office that evening, he thought about the assumptions people had made in the courtroom that morning. Judge Holbrook, Ada Chen, the court clerk, the bailiff, they had all looked at him and seen what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. Their preconceptions had been shaped by decades of societal conditioning, media stereotypes, and unconscious bias. But those assumptions hadn't hurt Marcus. They had underestimated him, which had given him a strategic advantage. While they were dismissing him as irrelevant, he was building federal cases that would destroy their careers and expose their corruption. The irony wasn't lost on him. Detective Morrison and officers like him had spent years assuming that young black men were criminals based on their appearance. Now, a young black man was sending them to federal prison based on their actual crimes. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against discrimination isn't anger or confrontation, it's excellence. Marcus Williams didn't need to argue with the people who underestimated him. He simply proved them wrong. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that competence has no color, authority has no age limit, and justice belongs to everyone who has the courage to pursue it. The next time you see someone and make assumptions based on their appearance, remember this story. Remember that the person you're looking at might be exactly the opposite of what you expect. And remember that in America, anyone, regardless of race, age, or background, can grow up to hold the power of federal law in their hands. That's not just justice. That's hope.